In the vast lands of the American Southwest, where the sun burns the sand and the wind speaks in whispers, a boy was born. His people called him Goyawe, which meant the one who yawns. But the world would come to know him by another name, a name that would echo through history. Geronimo. It was the year 1829, near the Gila River, in what is now Arizona. The world around him was wild and filled with danger, mystery, and endless open land. This was the land of the Chiricahua Apache, a proud people who lived free under the sun and moon. They were hunters, warriors, and survivors. They didn't have cities or walls. Their home was the earth itself, the mountains, the rivers, the canyons. And from this wild land, a warrior would rise. Goyawe was not born into peace. He grew up in a world of constant struggle. His people fought against enemies, sometimes other tribes, sometimes the soldiers of Mexico, who claimed their land. From a young age, he learned to ride horses, track animals, and hunt with skill beyond his years. He listened to stories told by the elders, stories of spirits, courage, and honor. He learned that the land was sacred, that every mountain had a spirit, and every stream carried wisdom. He was taught never to take more than he needed, and never to back down when his people were in danger. Even as a child, Goyawe had a quiet strength. He was small but fearless, gentle but brave. When other boys hesitated, he stepped forward. When storms came, he faced them head-on. The older warriors often said, "That boy has the fire of the mountain in his heart." As Goyawe grew older, the world around him began to shift. The Apache had lived on this land for generations, moving freely across what is now Arizona, New Mexico, and northern Mexico. But outsiders were coming, men with guns, wagons, and greed. First came the Mexican soldiers, and later the American settlers. They wanted land, gold, and power. They saw the Apache not as people, but as obstacles. The peace of the desert began to fade, and though Goyawe didn't yet know it, his life was about to be torn apart. By his early 20s, Goyawe had become a respected young warrior. He had proven himself in battle, hunted fearlessly, and earned the respect of his tribe. He married a woman named Alope, a kind and beautiful Apache girl. Together they built a small family, filled with laughter, love, and promise. They had 3 children, and for a while, it seemed that peace might last. He was happy. He loved his wife deeply. He loved his children. He was not yet a famous warrior. He was simply a man, a husband, a father, a son of the Chiricahua Apache, who wanted to live free under the open sky. But fate had other plans. It was a warm day when Goyawe and several men from his band rode south into Mexico to trade for supplies. They left behind their families in camp, his wife, his children, his mother, safe and waiting for their return. But when they came back, everything was gone. Their camp was silent. Smoke rose into the sky. The smell of death filled the air. Mexican soldiers had attacked while they were away. Every woman, every child, every elder, slaughtered. Among the dead were his mother, his wife Alope, and his 3 children. When Goyawe saw the lifeless bodies of his family, something inside him broke, and something else awoke. He fell to his knees, his heart shattering. The pain was too great for words. He cried out to the heavens, and in that moment the wind seemed to stop. He later said a voice spoke to him, the voice of the mountain spirit, promising him protection in battle and the power to strike down his enemies. That day, the man known as Goyawe died in spirit, and Geronimo, the warrior, was born. From that moment, Geronimo's life became one of vengeance, resistance, and survival. He vowed that no enemy would ever destroy his people again. He picked up his rifle, sharpened his knife, and began to hunt those who had taken everything from him. The soldiers called him Geronimo, a Spanish version of Geronimo, shouting it in fear when he attacked. Soon, the name spread across the land, whispered by settlers, shouted by soldiers, sung by the Apache. Geronimo became a symbol of resistance, courage, and freedom. He could move like the wind, disappear into the canyons, and strike from the shadows. To his enemies, he was a ghost. To his people, he was their protector. To himself, he was a man on a mission that would never end. That night, as the fire burned low and the stars filled the desert sky, Geronimo sat alone, holding a small piece of cloth that had belonged to his wife. He whispered her name into the wind. The world would never know his pain, but it would soon know his power. From the ashes of tragedy, a legend was rising, and the land would never be the same again. From love to loss, from peace to vengeance, the boy who wouldn't break was now the man who couldn't be stopped. This was only the beginning. Of Geronimo, the desert was quiet. Too quiet. Smoke still lingered in the air, twisting like ghosts above the ashes. The once lively Apache camp was now a graveyard, and in the middle of it all stood Geronimo, a man broken, a heart turned to stone. He had returned from trading with a few men, expecting to hear laughter, songs, the voices of his children. Instead, he heard only silence. His eyes scanned the ruins, the charred remains of tents, scattered belongings, the blood-soaked earth. And there, among the dead, he found his mother, his wife Alope, his 3 small children. He dropped to his knees. The world spun around him. The weight of grief crushed his chest. He wanted to scream, but no sound came. Only the wind howled, as if the desert itself was mourning. For 3 days, Geronimo did not speak. He did not eat. He sat beside the graves he dug with his own hands. He stared at the setting sun and felt nothing but emptiness. On the 3rd night, as the fire burned low, he stood and walked away from camp. He climbed a hill and knelt beneath the stars. Then he cried out, a sound of pain so deep it shook the ground. He shouted to Usan, the Apache creator, begging for power to avenge his family, and then he heard it. A voice, not from around him but from within him. It said, "No bullet will ever kill you. I will protect you. Go, take revenge." From that moment, Geronimo believed the spirits had chosen him, that he was invincible, protected by the power of the Great Spirit himself. When he walked back into camp, his eyes were no longer the same. The quiet young husband was gone. In his place stood a man the world would learn to fear. Geronimo gathered the remaining warriors. They had all lost something that day, mothers, wives, children. They were not just angry, they were shattered. He spoke to them in a calm, steady voice. "The Mexicans think they can burn our homes, kill our children, and break our spirit. But they are wrong. We will not rest. We will not forget." That night, under the dim light of the moon, the men painted their faces black for war. They sharpened their knives and loaded their rifles. Each one of them swore an oath of vengeance. They rode south, into Mexico, across the same ground the soldiers had come from. Geronimo led them silently like a shadow. He knew every canyon, every dry riverbed, every whisper of the wind. And when they found the soldiers responsible, the desert erupted with fury. The first attack came before dawn. The Mexican soldiers were sleeping in their camp, unaware that death was coming for them. Geronimo and his warriors surrounded the camp in silence. He raised his hand, a signal, and the night exploded with gunfire and screams. The battle was short and brutal. When the smoke cleared, the soldiers were gone. Geronimo stood among the dead, breathing heavily, his heart still burning. But when the fight ended, he felt no peace. Revenge could not bring back his wife or his children. He wiped the blood from his knife, looked at the horizon and whispered, "I will never surrender." Not until every enemy fears the name Geronimo. Word of his attack spread quickly through Mexico. Villagers and soldiers spoke of a ghost who struck from the mountains and vanished into the desert. They called him Geronimo, the Spanish version of Jerome, a name they shouted in fear as he attacked. The name stuck. Soon, Geronimo became a legend, a man who could not die, who could fight against entire armies and escape without a trace. He used the land as his weapon, moving through caves, hiding in the mountains, surviving on almost nothing. He became the master of guerrilla warfare long before the term existed. Years passed, but Geronimo's anger did not fade. He fought both Mexican and American soldiers, anyone who threatened Apache freedom. To him, the land was sacred. He once said, "The earth and I are of one mind. The measure of the land and the measure of our bodies are the same." His people followed him not because they feared him, but because he gave them hope. Hope that the Apache could still live free, even as the world around them changed. But war always comes with a price. Each battle took something from him, another friend, another brother, another piece of his soul. He began to realize that vengeance alone could not heal the wounds of his heart. Still, he could not stop. He had become what the world made him, a man of war. Some said he fought for revenge. Others said he fought for freedom. Maybe he fought for both. Years later, when he looked back, Geronimo said, "I was born on the prairies, where the wind blew free, and there was nothing to break the light of the sun. I was born where there were no fences, and everything drew a free breath. I want to die there, not in a prison." Those words carried the heart of a man who refused to break, a man who would rather die fighting than live in chains. They took his family, his peace, his heart, but they could never take his spirit. This was only the beginning of the war the world would never forget. The War of Geronimo. The fire of revenge had been lit. Geronimo had seen death, loss and pain, but from that pain, something powerful was born. A new kind of warrior, a man who believed he was chosen by the spirits to defend his people. This was no longer just a man's fight. It was the birth of a legend. After the raid that took his family, Geronimo changed. He became quiet, watchful, but inside a storm raged. He believed the Great Spirit had given him protection. He told his warriors, "Bullets cannot kill me. I am under the power of Usan," and somehow every time he fought, he lived. He would walk straight into enemy fire and come out untouched. To his men, it was proof. The spirits really were with him. They began to see him not just as a leader, but as something more, a bridge between man and spirit. He could sense danger before it came. He could find water where none existed. And when he spoke, the warriors listened. Geronimo gathered the strongest Apache fighters. He trained them not to fight like soldiers, but like shadows. They would strike and vanish before the enemy knew what happened. They learned to use the desert itself as a weapon. When the heat burned like fire, they hid in caves. When the night was cold, they moved silently under the stars. Their horses could travel for days without rest, and they could survive on little food or water. They became ghosts of the mountains, unseen, unstoppable and unbreakable. Geronimo taught them discipline, courage and unity. He reminded them of what they were fighting for: their homes, their freedom, their families. Every raid, every ambush, every battle was for the future of the Apache. The Mexican soldiers wanted him dead. The American army saw him as a threat. Even settlers told stories of him, stories that grew wilder with every telling. Some said he could turn invisible. Others said he could fly across the desert winds. But behind the legends was a man, tired, wounded, yet determined. He fought not for glory, but because he had no choice. Every time he tried to live in peace, the soldiers came again. They burned homes. They took more land. And every time, Geronimo rose again to fight back. Geronimo often rode alone into the canyons at night. He would kneel beside the fire and speak to the spirits. He asked for strength, for courage, for forgiveness. He did not fight only with weapons. He fought with faith, faith in the land, faith in his people, faith that one day they would be free again. He told his men, "The sun, the darkness, the wind, all listen when I speak. They are my brothers. They fight beside me." To his enemies, these words sounded like madness, but to the Apache, they were truth. Each time Geronimo's warriors attacked, they struck fear into soldiers' hearts. They would ride into camps at night, their faces painted black, their cries echoing through the mountains. They moved like ghosts, disappearing before dawn. No one could catch them. Even the army generals began to speak his name with respect and fear. Newspapers in both the U.S. and Mexico wrote about him. Some called him the Devil of the Southwest. Others called him the last Apache. But among his people, he was known as the Defender, the man who would never surrender. But being a leader was not easy. Every decision carried the weight of lives. Every raid meant risking the last of his warriors. Geronimo began to feel the loneliness of command. He was surrounded by followers, yet isolated by destiny. He carried guilt for every friend lost in battle. He often sat alone, staring at the fire, wondering if the fight would ever end. But each morning, when the sun rose over the desert, he stood again, because his people needed him. He knew that if he fell, the spirit of his nation might fall too. As his fame grew, so did the hunt. The U.S. and Mexican armies began working together to capture him. They sent scouts, soldiers, and even Apache trackers to find him, but Geronimo knew the land better than anyone. He could vanish into canyons so deep that sunlight barely touched the ground. He could hide his people where even eagles dared not fly. For every battle he lost, he won 2 more. For every camp destroyed, another rose. He was a man who refused to die, and that refusal became his greatest weapon. There were moments when even his warriors doubted. They were tired, hungry, hunted, But Geronimo would stand before them, tall and calm, and say, "We are Apache. We are the children of the mountains. The wind is our ally. The desert is our mother. No man can conquer what is born of the earth." Those words filled them with strength again, and once more they would ride out, fast, silent, unafraid. With each year, Geronimo's legend grew. Children whispered his name by firelight. Soldiers told stories of him that sounded more like dreams than truth. And yet he was real, a man of flesh and blood who refused to be broken. He had become more than a warrior. He had become the voice of a dying freedom, the heartbeat of a people who would not fade quietly into history. He had no armor, no army, no flag, only courage, faith, and fury. And with them, Geronimo turned the desert into a battlefield, and himself into a legend. The soldiers called him the ghost of the desert. To them, he was a nightmare, a man who could not be seen, caught, or killed. To his people, he was hope, and to history, he became a legend. This was the time when Geronimo became more than a man. He became a spirit of resistance, a shadow moving through the sands of the American Southwest, untouchable, unstoppable, unforgettable. The desert was harsh. It could kill a man within a day. No water, no shade, only burning heat and silence. But for Geronimo, the desert was not an enemy. It was his ally. He knew every canyon, every hidden spring, every trail that twisted like a snake through the rocks. When soldiers came, he vanished into the mountains. When they gave up, he appeared again, striking without warning. He used nature as his shield, the stars as his map, and the silence as his strategy. The land that killed his enemies gave him life. Geronimo once said, "The desert knows me. It hides me. It speaks to me," and it did. The desert became his fortress. By now, Geronimo's name echoed across two nations. The U.S. Army in the north and the Mexican Army in the south both hunted him, but he was always one step ahead. Scouts followed his tracks for days, only to find fake footprints leading them in circles. Camps that seemed abandoned would suddenly come alive with warriors. Then, as quickly as they appeared, they were gone. No one could understand how he did it. It was as if he could read the earth itself, every shadow, every rock, every gust of wind telling him where to go next. He was no longer just a warrior. He was a phantom. The soldiers grew desperate. They called him a devil, a ghost, even a demon. They couldn't believe a small band of Apache could defeat trained armies again and again. One American general said, "It is like chasing the wind. He appears when he wishes and vanishes before we can blink." Geronimo and his followers, sometimes no more than 30 men, women, and children, held off thousands. They moved fast, traveled light, and never stayed in one place long. They lived off the land, hunting rabbits, gathering roots, and sleeping beneath the open sky. Their only rule was survival. To the Apache, Geronimo was not just a fighter, he was the soul of their freedom. He reminded them who they were. He told them stories of their ancestors, of the old ways, of the mountains that still whispered their names. He said, "While I live, we will never bow to any man." And they believed him. Even those who feared death followed him, because to live in chains was worse. Under his leadership, the Apache became invisible, slipping between worlds, living between survival and myth. There were times when Geronimo's raids felt almost impossible. He would strike deep inside Mexico, burn a fort, free captives, and vanish into the desert before dawn. No trail, no trace, no sound. Soldiers who chased him often died of thirst or exhaustion before ever seeing his face. When they did, they saw a man with sharp eyes, weathered skin, and the calm of a hunter who had waited his whole life for the kill. He fought not with rage, but with purpose. Every move was deliberate. Every attack, a message. You may take our land, but you will never take our spirit. As stories spread, people began to imagine Geronimo as more than human. They said he could see the future, that he could stop bullets with his hands, that even death feared him. And though the stories were wild, one thing was true: Geronimo could not be stopped. Newspapers printed his name in bold letters. Settlers feared him. Children whispered about him by campfires. He became the symbol of the untamed West, the embodiment of freedom that refused to die. But being a ghost came at a cost. For every victory there was loss. For every raid there was another battle to fight. He lived in constant motion, no rest, no peace. The faces of his fallen people haunted him at night. The land that sheltered him also kept him lonely. He missed his family. He missed laughter. But he could not stop, not while his people still suffered under the hand of foreign armies. Sometimes, when the moon rose high, he would ride alone to the top of a mountain and speak softly to the wind. He would ask his ancestors for strength and for forgiveness. By now, even soldiers shouted his name before battle. Geronimo! They used it as a cry of courage, as if calling his spirit could make them brave. Ironically, the same name that once filled men with terror became a symbol of fearlessness for generations to come. The legend was already bigger than the man. There is a story told by one of Geronimo's men. One night, after a long battle, he found Geronimo sitting alone by the fire, staring into the flames. The man asked, "Do you ever tire of fighting?" Geronimo looked up and said, "A man who loses everything learns to live with the fight. The fire inside me cannot die while my people still suffer." That was Geronimo, calm, unbroken, and eternal. A man whose silence spoke louder than thunder. They hunted him across mountains, deserts, and rivers. But how do you catch a ghost? You don't. You only chase his shadow. The war for the Apache people was no longer fought on open ground. It was not just about guns and bullets anymore. It had become an unseen war. A war for survival. A war for identity. A war for freedom itself. Geronimo had been fighting for years. He had faced armies, hunger, betrayal, and endless loss. Yet he still rode on, because for him, surrender was death. After years of raids and resistance, many Apache bands were finally forced onto reservations, controlled lands where they were promised safety and food. But those promises were hollow. The land was dry, the rations poor, and the freedom gone. The Apache were not used to fences. They were a people of open skies. On the reservation, they were told where to live, when to eat, and even when to speak. Their traditions were banned, their weapons taken, their spirits slowly broken. Geronimo tried to live there for a time. But peace built on chains was not peace at all. He saw his people growing weaker, losing hope. He could not stand it. One night, he gathered a small group, men, women, and children, and whispered, "We were born free. We will die free." And under the cover of darkness, they escaped once more into the desert. When the U.S. Army discovered Geronimo had fled, the chase began again. It was 1885, and this time the government was determined to end it for good. They sent thousands of soldiers across Arizona, New Mexico, and Mexico to hunt one man. But they underestimated the desert's ghost once more. Geronimo and his people vanished into the mountains, striking from the shadows, raiding supply lines, and freeing Apache prisoners wherever they went. To the soldiers, it was madness. To Geronimo, it was survival. Every sunrise, they moved. Every sunset, they disappeared. The mountains were their home, the wind their guide, and the stars their compass. But Geronimo's war was not just against armies. It was against time. The world around him was changing. Railroads now cut through Apache land. Towns were rising where sacred canyons once stood. The buffalo were gone. The silence of the desert was being replaced by the noise of machines. He saw the old ways fading, and it broke his heart. He told his followers, "The white man grows stronger every year. He builds roads where our trails once ran. But he cannot take the spirit of the Apache unless we give it to him." That was the war now, not just for land, but for the soul of a people. Geronimo's small band, only about 35 warriors and their families, were hunted by over 5,000 soldiers. It was the largest manhunt in the history of the American West. The U.S. Army called him an outlaw. Newspapers called him a savage. But those who truly knew him understood. He was fighting for something sacred. Still, exhaustion was setting in. His people were tired. They had lost many along the way, to bullets, to hunger, to the endless running. Even Geronimo began to wonder if the spirit still walked beside him. The war seemed endless. Every time Geronimo was cornered, he escaped. Every time peace was offered, it was broken. And each time, more Apache blood soaked the desert floor. The soldiers began to see the futility of it. How do you defeat a man who has already lost everything? How do you capture a spirit that refuses to die? General Nelson Miles once wrote, "Geronimo fights like no other man. He uses the land as if it were his weapon, and the silence as if it were his shield. To the army, he was an enemy. But to history, he was becoming something greater. a symbol of rebellion that no force could silence. As the years dragged on, Geronimo grew weary. He had fought for decades. He had seen his people starve, his friends fall, his homeland vanish beneath foreign boots. The fire inside him still burned, but now it was mixed with sorrow. He began to ask himself if the fight was truly saving his people or destroying them. One night, around a small fire deep in the mountains, he told his warriors, "I have fought all my life. I have seen victory, and I have seen death. But the hardest battle is not with guns. It is within the heart." There was silence. Even the desert wind seemed to pause, but though doubt filled his mind, his spirit did not fade. When scouts came near, Geronimo still led his people through hidden paths, still fought with the same skill, the same precision, the same rage. He was slower now, but his eyes burned as bright as ever. He once said, "I was born where there were no fences. The earth was wide and free. That is how I will die." He was a man trapped in two worlds, one dying, one rising, and he refused to belong to either. The unseen war was not fought on the battlefield. It was fought in the heart of every Apache, between the memory of who they were and the reality of what they had become. Geronimo embodied that war. He carried the weight of a nation's sorrow on his shoulders, and even as the world closed in on him, he did not break. He could not, because Geronimo was more than a man now. He was a living echo of freedom itself. They thought the war was over. But how do you end a fight that lives inside every heart that refuses to surrender? The unseen war was only the beginning of the end. By 1886, the world had turned against one man. Every newspaper headline, every military order, every scout's whisper carried the same name: Geronimo. He had become the most wanted man in the American West. And now, the chase, the greatest manhunt in U.S. history, was about to begin. After years of raids and escapes, Geronimo was no longer just a warrior. He was a symbol of rebellion. To the government, that made him dangerous. President Grover Cleveland himself ordered the army to capture him at any cost. General Nelson Miles was put in command. He had nearly 5,000 soldiers, hundreds of scouts, and new technology, telegraphs, railroads, and repeating rifles. All of it, for one Apache man and a handful of followers. But Geronimo was no ordinary fugitive. He had survived against both the Mexican and American armies for over 30 years. He knew every canyon, every secret spring, every way to vanish into thin air. He was fighting not for glory, but for his people's right to breathe freely. The chase began in the Sierra Madre Mountains of northern Mexico, brutal burning land where even the soldiers feared to go. Geronimo and his small band, fewer than 40 warriors, women, and children, lived on the move. They traveled hundreds of miles, crossing deserts and mountains with no food but roots and wild game. Every time the army thought they had cornered him, he slipped away like smoke in the wind. Sometimes they could see his campfires in the distance, and by the time they arrived, the fires were cold. One soldier later said, "He was everywhere and nowhere. We chased him until our boots fell apart, and still, he laughed at us." But for Geronimo, this was not laughter. It was survival. The Apache spirit could not be caged. The land itself seemed to protect him. Rainstorms flooded army trails, mountains swallowed their paths, and mirages confused their scouts. Geronimo used every element, water, wind, heat, as a weapon. When soldiers tracked him through the desert, he would send false trails through rocky ravines. He knew how to walk on stones, leaving no footprints. He could hide an entire group in a canyon no wider than a man's shoulders. It was as if the desert fought beside him. To the Apache, the land was alive, and Geronimo was its chosen son. Weeks turned into months. Thousands of soldiers burned through supplies, grew sick with thirst, and fell to exhaustion. Still, Geronimo could not be caught. Frustration grew in the ranks. Some soldiers began to believe he was invincible, that the old stories were true, that bullets could not touch him. Even General Miles began to admire him, saying, "Geronimo is a genius of war. He is one of the greatest natural military minds I have ever known." Yet despite the praise, the army pressed on, because their orders were clear: bring him back, dead or alive. But inside Geronimo, something had begun to change. He was growing old. He had seen too much death. His people were weary, hungry, tired, and constantly running. Children cried from thirst. The women were weak. The old men could no longer walk. Each night, as he sat beneath the stars, he felt the weight of his choices pressing on him. He asked himself if this endless running was still saving his people, or only prolonging their suffering. He looked at the faces of those who followed him and saw not soldiers, but families who deserved peace. In the summer heat of 1886, Geronimo finally agreed to talk. The army sent Lieutenant Charles Gatewood, an officer who spoke Apache and had once known Geronimo personally. Gatewood rode deep into the Sierra Madre alone, a death wish to most men. When he finally found Geronimo's camp, the Apache leader stepped out of the shadows, his eyes dark and calm. Gatewood told him, "The war is over. Your people are starving. If you surrender, your families will be safe." Geronimo listened silently. Then he said, "The white man's words are like the wind. I have heard promises before." Gatewood nodded and replied, "This time I give you mine." For the first time in years, Geronimo hesitated. He looked at his people, thin, tired, desperate, and he knew the truth. The war might be over, but his heart was not. After weeks of negotiation, Geronimo finally rode out from the mountains with a small group of his people. He met General Miles at Skeleton Canyon, Arizona, under the blazing desert sun. Soldiers surrounded him, rifles ready, tension high. But Geronimo rode calmly forward, unarmed. He dismounted, looked Miles in the eye, and said, "Once I moved about like the wind. Now I surrender to you, that I may live in peace." Those words marked the end of the Apache Wars and the closing of the American frontier. A single man's surrender had ended decades of conflict. Yet in that moment, even his enemies felt the weight of history. When Geronimo handed over his rifle, the desert fell silent. It was the end of an era, the end of free Apache land. But though he gave up his gun, he never gave up his spirit. The soldiers took him as a prisoner, but they knew they had not truly won. Because legends do not die when they are captured. They live on, in stories, in songs, in the whispers of the wind. And in that endless desert, the name Geronimo would forever echo, not as a cry of defeat, but as a shout of defiance. The chase was over, but what they caught was not a man. It was a myth, and the spirit of Geronimo would never surrender. The sun burned high over Skeleton Canyon. The air was still, heavy, almost sacred. It was September 4th, 1886, the day the last free Apache warrior would lay down his gun. Geronimo sat on his horse, his face calm, his eyes cold. He had fought for over 30 years across deserts, mountains, and borders. He had outwitted armies, defied nations, and carried the weight of a people's freedom on his shoulders. But now, it was time. This was the final surrender. As Geronimo rode toward the meeting place, he looked at the land one last time. The red rocks, the endless sky, the dust swirling in the wind. It was more than just land. It was memory, spirit, and blood. Every mountain held the bones of his ancestors. Every breeze carried their whispers. He turned to his people, tired, hungry, worn thin from years of running. Mothers held their children close. Old warriors leaned on their rifles. They had given everything. Now they wanted peace, even if it came with chains. Geronimo took a deep breath and said softly, "We have fought enough. The earth is tired of our war. It is time to rest." And with that, he rode forward alone. General Nelson Miles waited in the canyon, surrounded by rows of soldiers. Their rifles gleamed in the sun, ready, though no one dared fire. All eyes turned to the lone Apache rider approaching through the dust. Geronimo stopped his horse, looked at Miles, and dismounted slowly. There was silence. Even the wind paused. He stepped forward and said, "Once I moved about like the wind. Now I surrender to you, that I may live in peace." Miles nodded, but the moment felt heavy. Not a victory, but an ending. He had captured the last free warrior of the West. The frontier, as the world had known it, was over. When Geronimo handed over his rifle, the Apache Wars, the longest war in American history, came to a close. It wasn't just a battle that ended. It was a way of life. For centuries, the Apache had lived free, no fences, no borders, no masters. Now that freedom had vanished into the dust. The newspapers celebrated it as a triumph. But to Geronimo's people, it was the death of a dream. One soldier later wrote, "There was no cheer that day, only silence." Even the victors did not smile. Geronimo and his followers were told they would be treated fairly. But instead of peace, they were made prisoners of war. They were taken in boxcars, first to Florida, then Alabama, and finally Fort Sill, Oklahoma. For years they lived under guard, far from the mountains that had raised them. The land was humid and foreign. The air smelled of grass instead of dust. The desert was gone, and with it, a part of their soul. Still, Geronimo remained proud. He refused to bow his head. Even as a captive, he carried himself like a chief, though he was never officially one. He told his captors, "I am not ashamed. I fought for my people. I did what was right." And those words, simple and strong, became his truth. As the years passed, Geronimo's name spread far beyond the West. He became a symbol of courage, rebellion, and the untamed spirit of the frontier. Newspapers printed his photo. Crowds came just to see him. To many Americans, he was no longer the enemy. He was the last true warrior of a vanishing world. He rode in parades, appeared at fairs, and even joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show for a time. He would sit tall on his horse as the crowd cheered, a prisoner turned performer, a hero wrapped in irony. He once said, "I am shown like a wild animal, but I am a man. I am Geronimo." And the crowd would roar, not realizing the sadness behind his eyes. In 1905, Geronimo met President Theodore Roosevelt in Washington, D.C. He came dressed in full Apache attire, proud, dignified, and silent. He shook the president's hand and asked for one thing: "Let my people return to our homeland." Roosevelt smiled, but refused. Geronimo bowed slightly, saying nothing more. He knew that freedom, once lost, rarely returns, but he also knew something the president did not: that you can imprison a man but not his spirit. In his final years, Geronimo spoke often to visitors and reporters. He told them stories of the old days, of the desert, the battles, the laughter of his people before the wars. He admitted he sometimes regretted surrendering. "I should never have given in. I should have fought until I was the last man." It wasn't pride, it was sorrow. The sorrow of a man who had lived long enough to see everything he fought for taken away. Yet even in old age, his fire remained. He rode horses, smiled with children, and spoke of the spirits that still guided him. The same wind that had once carried him into battle still whispered his name. He surrendered his rifle, but never his pride. They called it the end of the Apache Wars. But history would call it something else. The moment a man became a legend. When the great warrior surrendered, the world expected him to vanish, to fade into history like smoke on the horizon. But Geronimo did not disappear. He lived on, as both a prisoner and a celebrity. He had laid down his rifle, but he had not laid down his pride. And even behind bars, his name would grow louder than ever before. After his surrender in 1886, Geronimo and nearly 400 Apache men, women, and children were loaded into trains, guarded like criminals. The journey was long, hot, and suffocating. The people who had once roamed the open deserts of Arizona now looked out through steel bars at lands they had never seen. They were taken to Florida first, a place of swamps, humidity, and sickness. The Apache, used to dry desert air, suffered terribly. Many fell ill. Some died. The government called them prisoners of war, and that title would remain with them for the rest of their lives. Geronimo watched his people weaken and whispered, "They have taken our land, and now they take our health. But they cannot take our spirit." He refused to let despair define him. From Florida, Geronimo and his followers were moved again, this time to Mount Vernon Barracks in Alabama. There they lived behind fences under military watch. Years passed. The desert wind was gone, replaced by damp air and endless rain. But even in captivity, Geronimo's spirit did not bend. He became a leader among the prisoners, helping them adapt, encouraging them to work, farm, and keep their traditions alive. He told stories of the old days, of bravery, of the mountains that once echoed with Apache songs. The soldiers began to respect him, some even admired him. They said he had a kind heart, that he would help anyone, even those who once called him an enemy. By the early 1890s, something unexpected happened. The legend of Geronimo began to spread across the world. Newspapers printed his photograph. Writers called him the last Apache. People who had never seen the desert spoke his name with awe. He had become a symbol of freedom and rebellion, not just for Native Americans, but for anyone who had ever felt trapped or silenced. The government saw this, and slowly, they began to use his fame for their own purposes. They moved him again, this time to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Here, the Apache were allowed to live in small communities, to farm, and to rebuild their lives. But make no mistake, they were still prisoners. Geronimo was watched until the day he died. Despite captivity, Geronimo's fame exploded. People traveled thousands of miles just to see him. He was invited to appear at expositions and fairs, where curious crowds stared at him as if he were part of a museum. He sat proudly, dressed in full Apache attire, selling autographed photos of himself for a few coins. The world saw a hero, but behind his eyes was pain. He once said, "I am shown like a wild animal, but I am not one. I am a man who fought for his people." And yet, he continued to appear at these shows, not for pride, but for his people. The money he earned helped the Apache survive. If the world wanted to see a legend, he would make sure that legend fed his tribe. In 1905, something remarkable happened. Geronimo was invited to take part in President Theodore Roosevelt's inaugural parade in Washington, D.C. He rode proudly on horseback, wearing beads, feathers, and a steady gaze that commanded silence from the crowd. People cheered. They shouted his name. But Geronimo's mind was far from the celebration. After the parade, he met President Roosevelt face to face. The old warrior bowed his head slightly and said, "I have come to plead for my people. Let us return to our homeland." Roosevelt listened and refused. Geronimo said nothing more. He simply nodded, knowing that freedom, once taken, rarely returned. But his presence there, in the heart of the nation that once hunted him, was a victory of its own. In his later years, Geronimo lived a life of contradictions. He was both a hero and a captive, celebrated and confined, respected and misunderstood. He became a Christian convert for a time, though deep down, he still believed in the old Apache ways. He learned to farm. He rode in parades. He gave interviews to reporters from around the world. People loved to hear his stories, but few truly listened to his heart. He once told a visitor, "The white man knows how to make everything, but he does not know how to share it." It was not anger in his voice, only truth. Even in old age, Geronimo remained strong. He still rode horses, still smiled when children came to visit, still spoke of the mountains he longed to see again. But inside he carried the quiet ache of exile. He missed the wind, the stars, and the freedom of the desert nights. In the evenings, he would sit outside his small house at Fort Sill, staring at the horizon. He would whisper to himself in Apache, words no one else understood. And though his body was confined, his spirit wandered far beyond the fences that held him. They caged the warrior, but they could not silence the legend. From behind prison walls, Geronimo became something greater than any army could destroy. A symbol of defiance, a face of freedom, and the last breath of the untamed West. Time had not defeated Geronimo. Armies had tried, nations had tried, but in the end, it was only time that could touch him. By the early 1900s, the once feared Apache warrior was an old man. His hair had turned gray, his steps slower, but his eyes, those fierce, burning eyes, still carried the fire of the desert. He had survived battles, betrayals, and the end of his world. But now his final battle would be fought not with bullets, but with age. At Fort Sill, Oklahoma, Geronimo lived out his final years as a prisoner of war. He had been confined for nearly 2 decades, but he still woke before dawn each day. He would step outside his small cabin, breathe in the cool morning air, and whisper a prayer to Usan, the Apache creator. Even in captivity, He carried himself like a chief, proud, silent, commanding. Soldiers respected him. Children came to hear his stories. Visitors from far away, reporters, photographers, historians, sought his words. To many, he had become the last living symbol of the Wild West, a man who had stood against two nations and never bowed. Geronimo often spoke about the past. He remembered the wide lands of his youth, the rivers, the canyons, the buffalo that once roamed free. He would tell stories of battles fought in the rain, of nights when the stars guided his people home. And sometimes his voice would grow quiet as he remembered the faces of those he had lost. One day he told a visitor, "I fought because my heart was full of pain. They killed my family and I had no choice. But war is a heavy burden. It does not leave a man when the battle ends." His words carried no hate, only truth. Geronimo had lived long enough to understand that freedom and peace were not always the same. The world around him was changing fast. The railroads stretched across the land where his people once rode freely. The buffalo were gone. Cities were rising, and new generations had never known the world he fought to protect. Sometimes he would sit by the fence at Fort Sill, watching cars roll by on dirt roads. He would shake his head slowly and say, "The white man is clever. He makes many things, but the earth was better before he came. He was a man trapped between two worlds, the past he could never return to, and the future that had no place for him." In February 1909, the winter at Fort Sill was bitter cold. Geronimo was now nearly 80 years old, but he still rode his horse regularly, as he had done all his life. One evening, as the sun set, he rode out alone, as he always did, along a quiet trail that reminded him of the Arizona desert. But that night, the trail betrayed him. His horse stumbled in the darkness and Geronimo fell hard to the ground. He lay there for hours in the freezing rain, unable to move, calling for help that never came. When soldiers found him the next morning, he was weak and shivering. He had caught pneumonia. Even then, he fought to survive. He told the doctor, "I am not afraid. I have met death before." But this time there would be no escape. As his strength faded, Geronimo spoke softly to those around him. He asked about his horses, about the mountains, about the sunrise. Then, with a weak smile, he said words that would echo through history. "I should never have surrendered. I should have fought until I was the last man alive. It wasn't bitterness. It was regret." He had lived long enough to see the cost of surrender. His people scattered, their land lost, their spirit fading. And yet he had also seen them survive. That was his legacy. Not defeat, but endurance. On February 17, 1909, Geronimo took his final breath. The wind outside howled softly as if carrying his spirit back to the desert he loved. He was buried at Fort Sill, far from the land of his birth. But those who stood by his grave that day said the sky looked endless, just like the lands he once roamed. Geronimo's death marked the end of an era. He was the last great leader of the Apache Wars, the last free warrior of a vanishing world. But his name did not die with him. It lived on, whispered in stories, shouted in battle cries, and carried across generations. Years later, American soldiers would jump from airplanes and shout Geronimo, a cry of courage and defiance. The man they once hunted had become a symbol of bravery for the very nation that imprisoned him. History is full of irony. But Geronimo would have understood, because his fight was never truly against a single enemy. It was against the idea that freedom could ever be taken from the human spirit. Even now, more than a century later, the name Geronimo still carries power. It stands for rebellion, for courage, for never giving up, even when the world says you should. He was not perfect. He was human, proud, fierce, flawed, and unbreakable. And perhaps that is why his story still matters. Because in the end, Geronimo's greatest victory was not the battles he won, but the spirit he left behind. He was born free, he fought free, and he died dreaming of freedom. The warrior may be gone, but the wind still carries his name, Geronimo. Geronimo was gone, but his name had only just begun to live. The warrior who once roamed the deserts of Arizona, who defied armies and outlasted empires, was no longer just a man. He had become a symbol, not of war, but of the human spirit's refusal to bow. Even in death, Geronimo's shadow stretched far beyond the canyons that had hidden him for so long. in the years after his death. The name Geronimo took on a life of its own. Soldiers, paratroopers, and adventurers began shouting it before leaping from planes, a cry of courage, defiance, and pure fearlessness. Geronimo. They shouted as they jumped, as if calling upon his spirit to give them strength. It became a word that meant bravery in the face of death. The man the U.S. Army had once hunted now inspired their soldiers. History, it seemed, had a sense of irony. For the Apache people, Geronimo's story was not just history, it was identity. He represented every ancestor who refused to vanish, every voice that would not be silenced. Even in captivity, he had carried their pride. Even in death, he carried their memory. Children were told his story by campfires, how he fought without fear. How he rode through storms and deserts guided by the spirits. How he never stopped believing in freedom, even when the world told him it was gone. And in those stories, he lived on. As the 20th century unfolded, Geronimo became a global icon. Books were written about him. Films were made. Artists painted his face, the sharp eyes, the long hair, the quiet strength that seemed eternal. To some, he was a hero. To others, an outlaw. But to history, he became something greater. A bridge between the world that was and the one that came after. He was the last breath of the Old West, and the first whisper of what would become modern America, a land still haunted by the price of its expansion. But behind every myth, there is a man. And Geronimo, in truth, was both. He was fierce, yes, but also gentle. He could show mercy, even to enemies. He laughed, he wept, he prayed. He loved his family and mourned them every day of his life. History often paints him as a symbol of rage, but those who knew him saw something deeper. A man who carried the weight of loss and the burden of leadership. He did not fight because he loved war. He fought because the world left him no other choice, and that is why his story still moves us. Because in his struggle, we see our own. Decades passed, and the world changed. But the name Geronimo continued to appear. In songs, in books, in the hearts of those who believed in freedom. Activists, soldiers, artists, all found meaning in his defiance. His name became a rallying cry for anyone standing against injustice. A reminder that courage is not born in comfort, it is born in struggle. He had become more than a hero. He had become an idea that no power, no government, no prison could ever destroy. Visit the deserts of Arizona today, and you will still feel him there. In the silence between the rocks, in the whisper of the wind across the canyons, in the shifting sands that once carried his footprints. Some say if you listen closely at night, you can still hear the distant beat of Apache drums, a sound that reminds the land it once belonged to the free, because legends do not die. They return to the earth that made them. To shout Geronimo is not just to remember a man. It is to remember what he stood for. It means facing your fears. It means standing when the world tells you to kneel. It means fighting for what is right even when you stand alone. Geronimo's story reminds us that freedom has a cost, but it is worth every sacrifice. That no cage can contain the spirit of a man who refuses to be broken. And so, from the deserts of the past to the skies of the modern world, his name endures and a bridge between the earth and the wind, the warrior and the soul. 100 years have passed, yet his story still burns bright. Children still learn his name. His descendants still walk the land he fought to protect, and the world still remembers the man who rode with the storm and spoke to the mountains. "I was born on the prairie where the wind blew free," he once said. "And I want to die there, free." He didn't die on that prairie, but in spirit he never left it. The wind still carries his name, whispered by the earth, sung by the stars, remembered by all who dream of freedom. He was a man, a fighter, a father, a legend. His story is not just of war, it is of will. And as long as freedom has a voice, it will speak the name Geronimo.